Hello, and welcome to the Historical Podcast. In this episode, we will journey through more than 1,000 years of Polish history. We'll start in the mists of legend with a Slavic chief, a white eagle, and the birth of a nation. We will witness the rise of the vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a golden age of culture and a unique democracy of nobles. Chapter 1. The Nest of the White Eagle. Every nation begins with a story, a myth that anchors its identity in the deep past. For Poland, that story begins with three brothers, Lech, Czech, and Rus. Legend tells us that long ago, these three Slavic princes led their people out from their ancestral homeland, searching for a new place to settle. They traveled for months, through dense forests and over mighty rivers. Eventually, the brothers decided to part ways. Rus turned eastward, toward the vast, endless plains. Czech turned west, toward the rolling hills of Bohemia. But Lech, the youngest brother, continued northward with his tribe. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a deep red glow across the sky, Lech and his people came to a clearing dominated by a magnificent, ancient oak tree. And there, at the very top of the oak, was a nest. Guarding that nest was a majestic white eagle. As Lech watched, the great bird spread its wings against the crimson sky. He took it as a divine omen, a sign from the gods that this was their promised land. He declared to his people, "We will settle here." They named their first settlement Gniezno, from the old Slavic word, Gniazdo meaning nest. And to this day, the white eagle on a red field remains the proud emblem of Poland, a symbol born from that legendary moment. From this beautiful myth, history begins to emerge. The people who followed Lech came to be known as the Polans, the people of the open fields. And it is from them that Poland gets its name. In the 10th century, a powerful dynasty rose from among these tribes, the Piasts. The chronicles speak of early, semi-legendary dukes like Siemowit and Leszek, but the first truly historical figure, the man considered the creator of the Polish state, was Duke Mieszko I, who came to power around the year 960. Mieszko was a shrewd and ambitious ruler. He looked at the world around him and saw a critical choice. To his west lay the powerful, Christian Holy Roman Empire, which often used forced conversion as a pretext for conquest. To his east was the Orthodox Christian world. Mieszko made a decision that would define Poland's destiny for the next 1,000 years. On April 14th, 966, Mieszko I was baptized, and he adopted Western, Roman Catholic Christianity as the religion of his state. This baptism of Poland was far more than a religious conversion. It was a profound act of political strategy. By voluntarily joining the community of Western Christendom, Mieszko placed his fledgling nation under the spiritual protection of the Pope in Rome. He neutralized the threat of forced conversion from his German neighbors and integrated Poland into the political, cultural, and diplomatic framework of Western Europe. It was a masterstroke that secured Poland's sovereignty and set its cultural and political trajectory for centuries to come. The work Mieszko began was solidified by his son, Bolesław I, known to history as the Brave. Bolesław was a formidable warrior and a brilliant statesman. He expanded Polish territory dramatically, at times controlling lands as far as modern-day Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia. He established a Polish archdiocese in Gniezno, making the Polish Church independent from Germany. His life's work culminated in the year 1025, when he was formally crowned as the first king of Poland, with the blessing of the Pope. The Polish state, born in the eagle's nest, was now a recognized and respected kingdom in the heart of Europe. However, this early strength established a pattern that would haunt Poland throughout its history, a cycle of unity followed by division. After the reigns of the first powerful Piast kings, the kingdom began to fracture. For nearly 2 centuries, from the 12th to the 14th century, Poland was divided into a collection of smaller, competing duchies, each ruled by a different branch of the Piast dynasty. This period, known as the fragmentation, fatally weakened the country's central authority, and a weakened Poland became a tempting target. In the mid-13th century, a terrifying new threat appeared from the east: the Mongol hordes. The Mongols swept across Poland, burning cities and leaving devastation in their wake, though they ultimately failed to conquer the land permanently. This early history demonstrates two foundational truths of the Polish story. Its fate has always been tied to its geopolitical choices between East and West, and its strength has always depended on its ability to overcome internal divisions. Chapter 2. The Golden Age of the Commonwealth. The Piast dynasty, which had founded Poland, came to an end in 1370 with the death of King Casimir the Great, who left no male heir. This succession crisis could have spelled disaster, but instead, it led to a moment of political genius that would usher in Poland's golden age. The Polish nobles, the Szlachta, arranged a marriage between their young queen, Jadwiga, and the pagan Grand Duke of Lithuania, a man named Jogaila. In 1386, Jogaila was baptized, took the name the Ladisław to Jagiello, and was crowned King of Poland, founding the Jagiellonian dynasty. This personal union between Poland and Lithuania created one of the largest and most powerful political entities in all of Europe. The benefits of this union were immediate and dramatic. For centuries, the Teutonic Knights, a fearsome German military order, had been a thorn in the side of both Poland and Lithuania. In 1410, the combined forces of the Polish-Lithuanian Union met the Knights on a field near the village of Grunwald. The resulting battle was one of the largest in medieval Europe. The Teutonic Knights were utterly crushed. The Battle of Grunwald was a stunning victory that broke the power of the order for good and announced the arrival of a new superpower in Eastern Europe. Over the next century and a half, the partnership deepened. In 1569, with the Union of Lublin, the personal union was transformed into a full-blown federal state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or in Polish, the Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodowa, the Commonwealth of both nations. This was a state unlike any other. It was a vast, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious federation stretching from the Baltic Sea almost to the Black Sea, covering nearly 1 million square kilometers at its peak. But what truly made the Commonwealth unique was its political system. It was known as the Golden Liberty, or Złota Wolność. In an age when absolute monarchs were consolidating power across Europe, the Commonwealth was, in essence, a republic with an elected king. The true power lay not with the monarch, but with the nobility, the Szlachta. And in Poland, this noble class was enormous, making up nearly 10% of the population, a far greater proportion than anywhere else in Europe. Under the Golden Liberty, all nobles, from the wealthiest magnate to the owner of a small farm, were considered politically equal. This liberty was enshrined in a series of groundbreaking laws. The Nihil Novi Act of 1505 declared that nothing new could be decided without the consent of the Sejm, the noble-led parliament. Every new king had to be elected and had to swear to uphold the Henrician Articles, a Bill of Rights that severely limited his power. Most remarkable of all was the Warsaw Confederation of 1573. This act guaranteed absolute freedom of religion to all citizens of the Commonwealth. At a time when the rest of Europe was being torn apart by brutal religious wars, the Commonwealth became a sanctuary, a haven for Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews fleeing persecution. It's estimated that by the 16th century, the Commonwealth was home to nearly 80% of the world's Jewish population, who found a degree of safety and autonomy there that was unimaginable elsewhere. This period of stability, prosperity, and freedom led to an immense cultural flowering known as the Polish Renaissance. The capital, Krakow, became a vibrant European center of art, architecture, and learning. And it was in this environment of intellectual confidence that the Commonwealth produced one of the greatest minds in human history, Nicholas Copernicus. Born in the city of Taormina, Copernicus was a true Renaissance man, a mathematician, a physician, a diplomat, and a church administrator. But it was his work in astronomy that changed the world. For over 1,400 years, the Western world had believed the Ptolemaic model of the universe, which placed the Earth at the center of everything. Through meticulous observation and brilliant mathematics, Copernicus developed a revolutionary new theory. In his groundbreaking book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, published just before his death in 1543, he proposed that the sun, not the Earth, was the center of the universe. This heliocentric model was the spark that ignited the scientific revolution. forever changing our understanding of the cosmos and our place within it. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a radical political experiment, a republic of nobles that championed ideals of liberty and tolerance far ahead of its time. Its golden liberty was the source of its strength, its prosperity, and its vibrant culture. But this unique system, so different from the rest of Europe, also contained a fatal flaw. The very principles that made the Golden Age golden, the decentralization of power, the extensive freedoms of the nobility, and the strict checks on the monarch, would ultimately prove to be the seeds of its own destruction when confronted with the rise of powerful, centralized, and ruthless empires on its borders. Chapter 3. The Deluge and the Partitions. The Jagiellonian dynasty, which had overseen the rise of the Golden Age, died out in 1572. From that point on, every Polish king would be elected by the entire nobility, a system that, while democratic in principle, often led to political chaos and opened the door to foreign meddling. The Commonwealth's power, once so formidable, began to wane, and in the mid-17th century, the storm broke. This period is known in Polish history simply as potop, the deluge. It was a series of cataclysmic wars that brought the Golden Age to a bloody and catastrophic end. It began in 1648 with a massive Cossack uprising in the Commonwealth's Ukrainian territories, led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky. This brutal civil war bled the Commonwealth's armies dry. Seeing its neighbor weakened, Russia invaded from the east in 1654, and then in 1655, Sweden invaded from the north, hoping to seize control of the lucrative Baltic coast. It was a perfect storm of disasters. The Swedish armies swept through the country, capturing Warsaw and Krakow. For a time, it seemed the Commonwealth would be completely consumed. The devastation was almost unimaginable. It is estimated that the Commonwealth lost nearly a third of its population to war, famine, and plague, a greater proportional loss than Poland would suffer in World War II. The capital, Warsaw, was plundered and burned to the ground. Its pre-war population of 20,000 was reduced to just 2,000. The Swedes looted everything they could carry, from art and books to the very marble from the palaces, leaving behind a cultural desert. The deluge shattered the Commonwealth's economy, its military, and its spirit. It would never fully recover its status as a great European power. Yet, even in its decline, the old lion could still roar. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire laid siege to Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire. The fall of Vienna would have opened the door to an Ottoman conquest of Central Europe. In this desperate moment, Europe turned to Poland. King Jan III Sobieski, a brilliant military commander, led a combined European army on a daring forced march to relieve the city. In a spectacular charge led by his legendary winged hussars, Sobieski's forces smashed the Ottoman army and saved Vienna. He was hailed as the savior of Christendom. It was a final, heroic flash of the old Commonwealth's might, a moment of glory celebrated across the continent. But it could not halt the decay from within. The 18th century saw the Commonwealth descend into political paralysis. The liberum veto, a rule that allowed any single member of the Sejm to nullify all its legislation, was now routinely used by magnates bribed by foreign powers to sabotage any attempt at reform. The state was weak, ungovernable, and surrounded by powerful, ambitious, and absolutist neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They looked at the ailing Commonwealth, not with pity, but with hunger. What followed was not just a conquest. It was the deliberate, systematic dismemberment of a European state by its neighbors, an act that shocked the continent. In 1772, claiming they were restoring order, Russia, Prussia, and Austria colluded in the First Partition of Poland. They sliced off huge border territories, costing the Commonwealth a third of its land and nearly half its population. The shock of the First Partition spurred a generation of Polish reformers into action. In a desperate attempt to save their country, they drafted one of the most progressive documents of the age, the Constitution of May 3, 1791. It was the first modern, codified constitution in Europe, and the second in the world after that of the United States. It abolished the liberum veto, created a constitutional monarchy, and granted rights to the townspeople. It was a heroic attempt to transform the dying Commonwealth into a modern, functional state. But Poland's neighbors saw this attempt at revival not as a sign of hope, but as a threat. Empress Catherine the Great of Russia, in particular, could not tolerate a strong, independent Poland on her border. In 1792, Russian armies invaded, claiming to be liberating Poland from radical revolutionaries. Prussia joined in, and in 1793, they carried out the Second Petition, carving up even more of the country. The Poles made one last, desperate stand. In 1794, the Kosciuszko uprising erupted, led by Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a hero of the American Revolutionary War. It was a valiant but doomed struggle against overwhelming odds. After the uprising was crushed, the three empires moved in for the kill. In 1795, with the Third Partition, they divided up what little remained. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was erased from the map of Europe. For the next 123 years, there would be no such thing as Poland. The state was dead. Chapter 4. The nation that would not die. The state was gone, but the nation, the idea of Poland, refused to die. With its political institutions destroyed, Polish identity took refuge in the only places it could, in its language, its culture, and its deep-rooted Catholic faith. The 19th century, the long night of the partitions, forged a new kind of Polish nationalism. It was the nationalism of an oppressed people, one that was romantic, deeply spiritual, and utterly uncompromising. Compromise, after all, meant collaboration with the enemy. Hope flickered briefly during the Napoleonic era, when Napoleon Bonaparte, waging war against all three partitioning powers, created a small, satellite Polish state called the Duchy of Warsaw. Thousands of Poles flocked to his banner, fighting in Polish legions all across Europe in the belief that he would restore their homeland. But Napoleon was defeated, and the Congress of Vienna in 1815 handed most of the Polish lands back to Russia. The dream of a military restoration, however, did not fade. The 19th century became an age of insurrection, a series of heroic, tragic, and ultimately failed uprisings against Russian rule. The first was the November Uprising of 1830. It began when young military cadets in Warsaw rose up against the Tsar's plan to use the Polish army to crush revolutions in France and Belgium. The revolt quickly escalated into a full-scale war between Poland and the Russian Empire. Despite some initial victories, the vastly outnumbered Polish forces were eventually crushed. The aftermath was brutal. The Tsar abolished Poland's constitution, and a wave of repression swept the land. This defeat also triggered the Great Immigration, as thousands of Poland's political, intellectual, and cultural elite fled into exile, with most settling in Paris. A generation later, in 1863, the nation rose again. The January uprising was sparked by a plan for forced conscription of young Polish men into the Russian army for 20-year terms, a cynical attempt to remove potential revolutionaries. This time, the fight was a guerrilla war, waged by small bands of insurgents in the forests against the might of the Russian army. For over a year, they fought on, but the end was the same. The uprising was brutally suppressed. Thousands were executed, and tens of thousands more were deported to the frozen wastes of Siberia. A harsh policy of Russification was imposed, banning the Polish language in schools and public life in an attempt to extinguish Polish identity itself. With the path of armed rebellion closed, the battle for Poland's survival moved to a different front. If the nation could not have a government or an army, it would have its artists. The nation's capital was no longer Warsaw or Krakow. It was the salons and studies of its exiled geniuses in Paris. Its government was its poets. Its army was its music. No figure embodies this more than Adam Mickiewicz. He was Poland's national bard. It's Shakespeare and Goethe rolled into one. Exiled after his involvement in secret student societies, he spent most of his life in Paris. It was there that he wrote Pan Tadeusz, an epic poem that is considered the cornerstone of Polish literature. The poem is a loving, nostalgic portrait of the lost Lithuanian Polish gentry world of his youth. For generations of Poles living under foreign rule, Pan Tadeusz was more than a book. It was a sacred text, a portable homeland that preserved the memory of what had been lost. Mickiewicz also developed a powerful, mystical idea of Polish messianism, the belief that Poland was the Christ of nations, whose suffering and martyrdom at the hands of the empires would one day lead to the redemption and liberation of all oppressed peoples. If Mickiewicz was the literary soul of captive Poland, its musical voice was Frédéric Chopin. A child prodigy in Warsaw, Chopin left for Paris just before the November uprising of 1830 and never returned. Like Mickiewicz, he was an artist in exile, and his heart ached for his homeland. He poured this longing, this patriotism, into his music. His compositions, especially the heroic polonaises and the melancholic mazurkas, were infused with the rhythms and spirit of Polish folk music. The German composer Robert Schumann once wrote that Chopin's works were cannons buried in flowers. To the salons of Europe, it was beautiful, passionate music. To Poles, it was the sound of defiance, a reminder of their unbroken spirit. Through his art, Chopin kept the cause of Poland alive on the cultural stage of Europe, ensuring it would never be truly forgotten. During this long century of non-existence, Polish identity underwent a profound transformation. It became detached from the physical reality of a state and was reborn as an abstract ideal, a cultural, spiritual, and almost religious concept. This active preservation of the national soul through art and literature was not a passive act of waiting. It was a form of resistance, and it was this cultural fire, tended by the nation's exiled artists, that made the eventual rebirth of a Polish state possible. Chapter 5. Rebirth and Catastrophe. As the 20th century dawned, the world was hurtling towards a cataclysm that would redraw the map of Europe. For the Poles, the First World War was a strange and terrible conflict. Polish soldiers were conscripted and forced to fight against each other in the armies of the three partitioning powers, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. But the war also presented an unbelievable opportunity. For the first time in over a century, all three of Poland's oppressors were at war with one another. By 1918, the impossible had happened. The Russian Empire had collapsed into revolution. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had disintegrated, and the German Empire was defeated. In the power vacuum created by the collapse of the old empires, Poland was reborn. On November 11, 1918, the very day the armistice was signed ending the Great War, Poland reappeared on the map of Europe as a sovereign state, the Second Polish Republic, after 123 years of non-existence. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The statesman Józef Pilsudski, a former revolutionary who had been imprisoned by the Germans, became the first head of state, the chief architect of the resurrected nation. The 2 decades of the interwar period were a time of immense challenges. Poland had to stitch itself together from 3 different regions that had been under 3 different legal, economic, and administrative systems for over a century. It had to fight a series of border wars to establish its new frontiers, most notably against the newly formed Soviet Union. The political scene was turbulent, leading Pilsudski to stage a military coup in 1926 and rule as a virtual dictator until his death. But despite the difficulties, for 20 years, Poland was free. Then the storm gathered again. In August 1939, the 2 great totalitarian powers of Europe, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it was a promise of peace. Secretly, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact contained a protocol to once again partition Poland between them. On September 1, 1939, using a staged attack on a German radio station as a pretext, Adolf Hitler's armies invaded Poland from the west. This was the act that began the Second World War. The Polish army, though fighting bravely, was technologically and numerically overwhelmed by the German blitzkrieg. Then, on September 17th, as Polish forces were desperately trying to regroup, the Soviet Red Army invaded from the east, stabbing them in the back. Caught between 2 behemoths, Poland was crushed in a matter of weeks and subjected to its 4th partition. The occupation that followed was one of the most brutal in human history. This was not just a military occupation. It was a campaign of extermination. The Nazis aimed to destroy the Polish nation and its culture entirely. Polish intellectuals, priests, and political leaders were systematically murdered. Millions of Poles were deported for slave labor in Germany, and it was on the occupied soil of Poland that the Nazis built their machinery of genocide, the epicenter of the Holocaust. They established a vast network of ghettos in cities like Warsaw and Lodz, and built their most infamous death camps: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. The human cost was staggering. Nearly 6 million Polish citizens were murdered by the Nazis. That number includes approximately 3 million Polish Jews, fully 90% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population, and between 1.8 and 3 million non-Jewish ethnic Poles. But even in this darkest of nights, the Polish spirit of resistance did not die. A powerful underground state, loyal to a government in exile in London, operated throughout the war. Its military arm was the Home Army, or Armia Krajowa. In the summer of 1944, as the Soviet army was pushing the Germans back and approaching Warsaw, the Home Army saw a chance. They decided to launch an uprising to liberate their own capital before the Soviets could liberate it for them, hoping to establish a free Polish government. The Warsaw Uprising began on August 1st, 1944. For 63 days, the men, women, and even children of Warsaw fought with incredible courage against the vastly superior German forces. They expected help. The Soviet Red Army was just across the Vistula River, close enough to hear the sounds of battle. But the help never came. In a cynical act of political calculation, Joseph Stalin ordered his armies to halt their advance. He refused to aid the uprising and even denied Allied planes the right to use Soviet airfields to drop supplies to the beleaguered Poles. Stalin was content to let the Nazis do his dirty work for him, eliminating the fiercely independent, pro-Western Home Army, which would have resisted a Soviet takeover. The result was a tragedy. Alone and out of ammunition, the Home Army was forced to surrender. In retaliation, an enraged Hitler ordered Warsaw to be systematically leveled, building by building, until it was nothing but a pile of rubble. Over 200,000 Polish civilians were killed in the uprising. The tragedy of Poland in World War II is defined by this dual betrayal. It was the first nation to stand up and fight Nazi Germany, yet it was partitioned and attacked by two aggressors at once. Its heroic attempt to liberate its own capital was not just defeated by its enemy, but deliberately allowed to fail by its supposed ally. This experience of being caught and crushed between two brutal totalitarianisms is fundamental to understanding Poland's post-war history and its deep-seated distrust of the powers to its east. Chapter 6. Solidarity and Freedom. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, Poland found itself liberated by the Soviet Red Army. But this was not the liberation the Poles had fought and died for. With the Home Army crushed and the Western Allies making concessions at conferences like Yalta, Stalin was free to install a puppet communist government in Warsaw. The country's borders were shifted dramatically westward, losing vast territories in the east to the Soviet Union and gaining former German lands in the west. For the first time in its history, Poland became an ethnically homogeneous nation, but at the cost of being trapped behind the Iron Curtain as a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Life in the Polish People's Republic was a grim affair. The early years were marked by harsh Stalinist repression, show trials, and the persecution of anyone deemed an enemy of the state. While the country underwent major industrialization and urbanization, the centrally planned economy was chronically inefficient, leading to constant shortages and economic hardship. But the Polish spirit of defiance, honed over centuries of occupation, simmered just below the surface. Periodically, it would boil over in massive protests and strikes, as in 1956 and again in 1970. Each time, the regime responded with brutal force, but the discontent never went away. Then, in 1978, something happened that no one could have predicted. The College of Cardinals in Rome elected a new pope. And he was not Italian. He was Karol Wojtyla, the charismatic Archbishop of Krakow. He took the name Pope John Paul II. The election of a Polish pope sent an electric shockwave through the nation. When he made his first pilgrimage back to his homeland in 1979, millions poured into the streets to greet him. His message was not explicitly political, but it was revolutionary. He spoke of spiritual strength, human dignity, and the inalienable rights of man. He told his people, "Be not afraid." In doing so, he broke the communist state's monopoly on public life and gave millions of Poles the courage to imagine an alternative Poland, a civil society independent of the government's control. The seeds planted by the Pope bore fruit just a year later. In August 1980, in response to a hike in food prices, workers at the Lenin shipyard in the Baltic port city of Gdansk went on strike. Their leader was a charismatic, mustachioed electrician who had been fired for his activism, Lech Walesa. This was not just another protest. The Gdansk strike, with the help of intellectual dissidents, quickly grew into a nationwide movement. They formed Solidarność, or Solidarity, the first independent, self-governing trade union in the entire Soviet bloc. The movement grew to include 10 million members, a third of the country's population. It was a peaceful revolution that brought the communist state to its knees. In a stunning concession, the government signed the Gdansk Agreement, officially recognizing Solidarity's existence. For 16 months, Poland breathed free. But the hardliners in Warsaw and Moscow were not about to give up power. On the night of December 13, 1981, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, the head of the government, appeared on television and declared martial law. Solidarity was banned. Tanks rolled through the streets. Thousands of activists, including Lech Walesa, were arrested and imprisoned. The dream, it seemed, was over. But you cannot imprison an idea. The spirit of solidarity survived underground, supported by the Catholic Church and fueled by a collapsing economy. By the late 1980s, with a new, reform-minded leader in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Polish regime was bankrupt and desperate. A new wave of strikes in 1988 forced them to do the unthinkable: negotiate with the outlaws of solidarity. These round-table talks in early 1989 resulted in a historic compromise. Solidarity would be relegalized, and semi-free elections would be held, the first of their kind behind the Iron Curtain. The communists reserved most of the seats in the main House of Parliament for themselves, believing they could manage a slow, controlled transition. They miscalculated badly. In the elections on June 4, 1989, Polish voters were given their first chance in half a century to have their say. The result was a political earthquake. Solidarity candidates won every single seat they were allowed to contest. It was a total, humiliating repudiation of communist rule. This landslide victory led to the formation of the first non-communist government in the Eastern Bloc in over 40 years. Poland's peaceful revolution was the spark that lit a prairie fire. It showed that the Soviet Empire was a paper tiger. Just months later, the Berlin Wall fell. One by one, the communist regimes of Central and Eastern Europe collapsed. The fall of communism in Poland was not simply an economic or political event. It was a societal and moral revolution, driven by a unique alliance, a holy trinity of opposition that could only have come together in Poland. The organized power of the workers in solidarity, the strategic guidance of the intellectual dissidents, and the immense moral and spiritual authority of the Catholic Church, personified by a Polish pope. This combination created a force that the regime could imprison, but in the end, could not defeat. Conclusion. And so, the phoenix rose again, from the legendary nest of the White Eagle to the golden age of the Commonwealth. Through the fire of the deluge and the ashes of the partitions, a nation kept alive in the poetry of Mickiewicz and the music of Chopin. Reborn in 1918, only to be plunged into the catastrophe of World War II, betrayed by both East and West, and then, after decades of communist rule, rising one last time, not through violence, but through the power of solidarity, to lead all of Central Europe to freedom. The story of Poland is a testament to the incredible power of resilience, faith, and culture to sustain a nation even in the complete absence of a state. It is a reminder that borders can be redrawn and governments can be toppled, but an idea, a shared identity, can prove to be indestructible. In the years that followed its final liberation, Poland successfully transitioned to a democracy and a thriving market economy. It completed its long-dreamed-of return to Europe, joining NATO in 1999 and the European Union in 2004, firmly anchoring its security and its destiny with the West, just as Mieszko I had sought to do over 1,000 years ago. The journey has been long, and often agonizing. But the story of Poland, the phoenix of Europe, is ultimately one of triumph. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of Poland. If you've been captivated by this story, please subscribe to our podcast. In future episodes, we'll be diving deeper into some of the incredible moments and figures we've touched on today, from the winged hussars of Vienna to the codebreakers of the Enigma machine. Until then, this has been Phoenix of Europe.